And the basic topic we will be discussing today is when there is room to rely on Roiv, on Chazaka, on various different Yesodis and Dines Fakis. Efsher levarer. But we could escape the suffix. Are we supposed to check things out and verify and make sure that we're on the safe side, that we're not over an Isser, and not rely on Roiv, Chazaka, Svek, Uchedoime? And to what extent do we need to go out of our way? And how much tercha do we need to take upon ourselves to be mevarer Svekis in halacha? So, I think the sugya kamat is mayim she'ein lehem soif. There are probably hundreds of different sources, but because these shiurim, by their very nature, I don't paskan halacha l'maisa. It's more shashua shel Torah. It's just enjoying the tremendous chus of simchas HaTorah. So I will touch upon 5 different sources, and I will have no clear-cut conclusions, but more a discussion of various different sources and concepts. So let's start off with mitzvahs tzitzis. Orach Chaim Simachas Sif Tes, we learn a halacha. Every day in the morning before you put on your talis, ya'ayin b'tzitzis. You need to check your tzitzis, because if some of your tzitzis were torn and you don't have kosher tzitzis, then you're going to make a bracha levatolem. And that is why every day in the morning the minhag is brought in Shulchan Aruch Sif Tet Siman Ches. You need to check the tzitzis kedei shelo yevorach bracha levatolem. The source of this halacha is in Rosh. The Rosh halachas ketanis in Hilchas Tzitzis. The Rosh writes, Hachoreid el devar Hashem. If a person is a Yir Shamayim, he should check his tzitzis every day, not to be over on a bracha levatolem. And the Tur quotes this Rosh Siman Ches, and the Bes Yosef quotes it following the footsteps of the Tur. However, it is noteworthy that the Rosh writes Hachoreid el devar Hashem, but the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch seem to say that it's a chiyuv on every person. So the Beis Yosef quotes another Rosh, and it seems to be a contradiction between the 2 different sources. Tshuvas Rosh, Klal Beis, Siman Tet. The Rosh writes, we could rely on chazaka, and if these tzitzis were kosher yesterday and the day before yesterday and last week and last month, they're probably still kosher. That is the concept of a chazaka. We rely on chazaka, and therefore minhag ha'olam is not to check your tzitzis. So the Rosh says, yes, even though the Beis Yosef says, even though the Rosh and the Tshuvas write that it's not a chiyuv, but the Torah still decided to quote the other Rosh, the one in Hilchas Tzitzis. And the Bach understands from the Beis Yosef that the Beis Yosef does feel that this is a contradiction between 2 different sources and the Rosh. But the Bach comments, Lanias Daiti, it's not a stira at all. Me'ikar din, there is no chiyuv, and minhag ha'olam is not to check your tzitzis. But if you're a Reish Shamayim, you should. But obviously, the Beis Yosef feels that even if you're not, the Shulchan Aruch does write Bal Nefesh Ya'ayin B'tzitzis. He writes, everyone should do that. So the Bach himself says, I think it's a chiyuv, and you cannot rely on this chazaka. And why not? Because it's a chazaka detalye b'maisa. What does that mean? The Bach quotes the Gemara in B'choros Chaf Amud Aleph. B'choros Chaf Amud Aleph, the Gemara says that you don't rely on a rov detalye b'maisa. What is the context in B'choros Daf Chaf? If you bought an animal, a female animal, and it had a little calf, that calf is a suffix b'char, because you don't know whether it's the firstborn or not the firstborn. And the Gemara asks, but if the animal is 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 years old, why wouldn't we say Rov Behemis Misabros Yoldos at age 1 year or so? So why would it still be a suffix? Why wouldn't we rely on Roiv? And the Gemara says, Ruba Detalia B'maisa. It is up to people whether this animal will have offspring or not, and therefore we don't rely on a Ruba Detalia B'maisa. The Bach says the same is regarding Chazaka. And the Mogen Avraham Sif Kut Aleph totally rejects the Bach, and he says, Ein hanidon domeh l'raya. Ruba Detalia B'maisa is not a reliable roiv. When we rely on roiv, it needs to be a roiv b'teva hu oilam. It needs to be natural phenomena. Like Rav Behemoth's Ksherois, Ruba D'Inchetoba B'ibure Diyarcha. Most people are healthy and they're not a source or an islandist or many other sources in Shas. But relying on a roiv that might change, it depends on behavioral patterns and Maise b'nei Yodam, that is not a reliable roiv. But when we're dealing with Chazaka de Mekora, why would it make a difference how this reality came to be? The Rosh quotes the Gemara beginning of Nida, a mikveh has a cheskes ksheris. So if we check the mikveh a week ago and it had arboim, so it's a kosher mikveh, and somebody toivels, then he's toil. Why? Maybe they're no longer as memso chazaka de mikora. So a mikveh isn't natural phenomena. Somebody filled up that mikveh. Maybe the same person that made the tzitzis. So why don't we rely on the chazaka of tzitzis and we do rely on the chazaka of mikveh? So the Mogen Avraham has another argument that he says, because that is very common, it is very shachiach that tzitzis are torn. And he draws a similarity between tzitzis and another halacha in Hilchas Mikvois, Yoredei Arish Aleph Samachei, Mikveh shemuchzekes shemeimeo misma'atin, we do not rely on chazaka. If we know that this mikveh is losing water, how does the mikveh lose water? Either by leakage or by evaporation. But yeh ech sheyeh, if we know there's a chazaka that this mikveh loses water, then you need to check the mikveh every time you toivel, and you cannot rely on chazaka de mekora. So the Mogen Avraham says the same would apply to tzitzis. Interesting. Turei Zov Sif Koten Ches maintains it's only a chumre mishum brocha ravatola, and that is why the Taz says both the Rosh and the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch say Ya'ayin b'tzitzis b'kol yom kedei shelo yavorach brocha ravatola. So why is it only about brocha lavatola? There's an issa to be loivesh, to wear a garment that has dalat kanfus without tzitzis. It's a bittul mitzvah tzitzis. So the Taz argues, no. Mi'ikar adin, we rely on chazaka. It is only because the chumri yaseh of brocha lavatola that we say you need to check that garment. Both the Taz and the Mogen Avraham ask a very fundamental question. Why wouldn't we say there's a chiyuv to be boidig the tzitzis, even though we do have a chazaka? Because kishe'efsher levarer, we do not rely on chazaka. And that brings us to source number 2. Yoredeya Siman Aleph Sif Aleph. Hakol mitzuyen, roiva mitzuyen eitzel shchita mumchem heim. So when a shoichet shechts an animal, whether it's a chicken or a cow, you rely on that shchita, and you do not have to check out the shoichet. Rov hamitzuyen eitzel shchita mumchem heim. However, the Ramban Sechet Chulin of Gimel Amud Beis brings Kabbalah Sagaonim. If the shoichet is present, you need to check him out. We do not rely on roiv kishe'efshar levarer. So both the Taz and the Mogen Avraham are mefalpel. Would we say the same regarding tzitzis? Yes, there is a chazaka. These tzitzis were kosher yesterday, the day before yesterday, last week, last month, but you could check them. So maybe that is the reason tzorach la'ayin b'tzitzis. Maybe. It is definitely one of the different approaches to explain this then. So the Rosh says there's a chazaka. But the other Rosh says you need to check it out. Maybe because efshar levarer. Shivas Tzion, Reb Shmuel Ando, was the Bchor, the oldest son of the Noid B'Yudah, and he was Mamale Mekoyim Avois of a phenomenal Gadol B'Yisrael. And in his Shuvas, Shivas Yen Semalamad, he argues, no, because checking your tzitzis every day in the morning is a tercha. V'kesheyocha lavarar alidei tercha, there is no chiyuv to be mavarar. So it's not much of a tercha just checking your tzitzis. It takes a half a minute. But Shivas Yen argues, but imposing on a person to do that every day in the morning would be defined as a tercha yasera, and therefore it would not be a chiyuv. So this is source number one. Tzorech levarer, but if it's a tercha gedola, ein tzorech levarer. So let's go back to source number two. Rav Mitzur Netzer Shchita mumchem heim, and we rely on Rav. But the Ramban brings Kabbalah and Hagaonim. If the Shochet is here, you need to check him out. Ve'im Kabbalah nekabel oisoi b'seva ponim yofes. That's a beautiful melitza from the Ramban. And now the Talmidim of the Ramban, the Rashba and the Roa, have a big machlokes in Toras Habayis. I don't recall whether I told you the story of this fascinating work, Toras Habayis. So the Rashba was the undisputed Gadol Ador of his time, and the Rashba wrote many Svarim. One of his Svarim is Toras Habayis. Toras Habayis is an Issa V'Heter, and the structure of the Sefer is Batim and Shiurim. Every home has different gates, different entrances. So Bayis Aleph, Shar Aleph. The Rashba, based on the Ramban, says, we do rely on Rav, and therefore, if a Shochet shechted an animal, we assume it's kosher. Even if we didn't check out the Shochet. But if the Shochet is present, you need to check him out. And the Rashba maintains that is a halacha psuko. The Ra'ah, a contemporary of the Rashba, wrote many hasagas and many arguments against Toras Habayis, and he called his sefer Bedek Habayis. Bedek Habayis is checking out the house. There are companies in Israel that's their expertise, destroying contractors. So a guy buys a house, and then he pays 10,000 shekel for a company, Bedek Habayis, and they come in and they find a million problems in that house, and then you go to court and you put in a claim against the kablan. Usually it's not very decent and not very nice. But anyway, the Ra'ah writes a sugas on Toras Habayis, and he called them Bedek Habayis. But the Rashba is not the one to be intimidated. So the Rashba wrote a second sefer called Mishmeres Habayis, in which he totally rejects all the complaints, or most of the complaints of the Ra'ah and Bedek Habayis. So anyway, the Rashba, Bayis Aleph, Shar Aleph, Toras Habayis, says this is a halacha. The Ra'u argues it's just a midas chasidus, just a midas chasidus. Mi'ikar adin, we rely, Roiva Mitzur Netzer Shchita mumchem, and you don't need to check out even if the Shochet is present. We rely on a Roiv. And the Rashba in Mishmeres Habayis has a very interesting comment, and he says, yes, it's a midas chasidus, but it's a midas chasidus shera'ui l'kol yisol v'hakol chayovim bo kedei shelo nis'alim min ha'isur. And this is a fascinating new concept. It's a midas chasidus, but it's a midas chasidus that is a chiyuv. Interesting. It's not a halacha psuka. By its nature, it's a midas chasidus, but in practicality, it's a chiyuv. Ki efshar להתעלם מן האיסור. You just can't ignore a chashash, maybe you're doing an avera. And the way I understand it, the Mishnah says, Masechet Avos, Havei boreach min ha'avera. Havei boreach min ha'avera. So how could you ignore the possibility maybe you're doing an avera? It's biyadcha. Open your eyes. Check it out. What's wrong with you? So the Rashba says, well, yes, might be a midas chasidus, but it's a midas chasidus shera'ui l'kol yisrael v'akachiyom kedei shelo leis'alem min ha'isur. And I think, based on this novel concept of the Rashba, I want to go back to checking your tzitzis. So I said the source of this halacha is the Rosh. The Rosh writes, "Hachored el devar Hashem." So why did the Tur and Shulchan Aruch quote this halacha for everyone? And I say, yes, hachored ledvar Hashem. But we all need to be chored ledvar Hashem. You're supposed to be a Yerei Shamayim. You're supposed to be a Bereach min Avera. So how could you just ignore What's wrong with you? Take your tzitzis and check them. What's your problem? Yes. So the understanding of the Tur and the Bisyos of the Shulchan Aruch is Chored al Devar Hashem, but who is not Chored al Devar Hashem? And the Hagdorah is I Efshar Ein Lis Alem Minhu Isur. So what is the halacha of the Shoichet left the office? He left the mashchita, but you can still run after him and catch him. Do you need to do so and check him out? That's a machlokes in the poskim. Pri Chodesh Sivkot Nei says yes, yes. Tvuas Shor and the Pri Megadim as well in Mishbetzai say it's a tercha, and you don't have to be mevarer al yedei tercha. If the shochet is right here, you need to check him. If not, you need to go look for him. You need to run after him. Don't need to do so. So how much tercha is one mechuyev to exert to be mevarer sfeikis? Is it possible to define? The Maharsham, his Sefer Das Torah and Hilchos Shchita, in the Psicha le Hilchos Shchita Kuntas Acher Noischov Dared, tries to resolve this issue from different sources in Shulchan Aruch. Netilas Yadayim Letfila, davening with a minyan, Siman Tzaddik, I think at Sif Tesvov, you need to go Dalet Parasa before, in the direction that you're going. If you're Mahalach B'derech, you need to go 1 mil backwards. Would the same apply to checking out a Shoichet? The Das Torah, the Masham, doesn't come to a clear conclusion, but the Tviyah Shor clearly says, Hakal Afiyah Winyan, Hakal Afiyah Adam. It's impossible to give a basic formula. First of all, there's a difficulty to define the level of tircha. I made this clear in Minchas Osher Parshas Vayetze, but it also depends on the nature of each and every halacha, so it's impossible to give a clear definition. How much tircha is one mechiyuv to be mevaras veikis? So the first sugya we touched upon is tzitzis, dealing with chazaka. Second one is shchita, dealing with roiv. Number 3, still shchita, chazaka. Yud ches, yud beis. Yoredesem and yud ches, sif yud beis. You need to check the second shchita not only before you shecht, after you shecht as well. And after you shecht each and every animal. Between one and the other you need to check the sakin. And this halacha is based on Chur and Daftes, and primarily Rashi on the spot. And once again, there's a machlokes in this halacha as well. Is it miyikar adin or is it only a midas chasidus? Rambam clearly learns that this is a halacha. The Balamora, Perakam de Chulin, says it's only a midas chasidus. And the Shulchan Aruch says you need to check after each and every animal. Why? Because if you're going to find that the sakin was nivgam and it's puzzle, then we're going to passel and answer all the animals lemafreya. So there are 2 reasons why you need to check after every animal. Number 1, hefsid meruda. It's just chaval. If you're going to shecht 1,000 animals, and then at the end of the day you're going to find that the sakin has a begima, then all these animals will be osar. And that's a huge loss. The other reasoning that we find in Rishonim, we are afraid that by the time you're going to check that sakin, some people would eat the meat, and nimsa oichel nevela lemafreya. So there are more comments in that very same sif that if a person doesn't want to check the sakin between one animal and the other, he doesn't have to. It's his preference. I think that a more is acceptable if the reasoning is monetary loss. So if you want to take it upon yourself, go ahead, but chaval. But if the reason we paskin that he needs to check the sakin between one animal and the other is because we're afraid somebody might eat the meat before the end of the day, before we check that sakin shchita, then I don't think that a Mo's ruling would be acceptable. So maybe it depends what is the basic reason. So in this halacha, once again, we find a machlokes, and if it's a tercha to check that sakin, we need to bring a shoichet, and the shoichet left the premises. Do we need to bring him back? Pri Toya says even b'mokam tercha, you need to check that sakin. Prima Godim in Mishbetzois is Mesupik. Maybe not. If it's a Terchi Seder, maybe we don't need to do so. So this is Sugya number 3. We're still in Hilcha Shchita, but we're dealing with the Chazaka. The second Shchita was kosher before we shechted, because we checked the second before starting, and we need to check it again after the Shchita. And there's a Machlokes b'mokim Tercha Yisrael. Source number 4. By Yisaveta we rely on Roiv. Teisha Chanoyes. Tishu Moichem Bosa Shchuto. Echad Moisa Bosa Navela Nimso Hoilchem Achar Haroiv. However, if it's a Miyata Motzui, we are Machmir. This is one of the very rare halachas. The basic source is Medrash Rabbah, quoted by the Ramban and Malcham. It's interesting. But the Rashba also brings this halacha Mishmei Sabayis. And there are 2 seifim in Shulchan Aruch which are based on this halacha. Miut HaMotzi were Machmir. Lamed Tasif Alaf in Yoredeya. Chai Treifes, we don't need to be boidik. The lung of the animal, Bedika Sareya, we do, because it's a Miut HaMotzi. Pei Dalet Sif Ches. Peres and Yerokas, in which it is common to find bugs and insects, we need to be boidek. So these 2 seifim in Shulchan Aruch, they are based on the assumption, even though Holchem Achar Rav, but Miyat HaMotzi, we do not rely on Roiv. In my form of various different sources, I dealt with the Machlokes, the Rivash, and the Mishkeres Yaakov. How do we define Miyat HaMotzi in numbers? I don't want to go into the sugya right now. We dealt it with the past. I wrote about this in various tshuvas. Doesn't fit into today's context. But Miut HaMotzui, we do not rely on Roiv, Ela Tzorach Livdoik. And if the Bedika involves Terche Gedoyle, do we still need to check? And this is a very relevant question regarding Teluim, regarding Shatnez, Lamoshel. Most suits aren't Shatnez. But if it's a Miyat HaMotzui, but the layman, the customer that bought a suit, doesn't know how to check. So he needs to drive an hour to a laboratory that checks shatnez, and he needs to wait a month and a half, and he can't use that new suit. That would be a terche gedoyle. So regarding the halacha that by Miyat HaMotzi we don't rely on Roiv, is that b'mukim terche as well? Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and I am a great admirer of Reb Shlomo Zalman. He was a giant. And as great as he was such a humble person and such an honor. So Reb Shlomo Zalman Mincha Shlomo Chelik Beis Mesamech Gimel writes as if it's a davar poshut. And he writes, Mavur b'poiskim sheb'miyat HaMotzi afilu b'terche yisrael. You need to check out. You need to be mevarer. And he doesn't say, where is that Mavur b'poiskim? And I recall at least 3 sources from Chashuvei Achronim that say, the birur by Miyat HaMotzi, if it's a terche yisrael, you don't need to be mevarer. Shalas Yeshuvas Tuv Tam V'das Reb Shlomo Kluger Mahadura Klisoi. That means Chelik Gimel Kuf Nun Ches. Chuvas Tzemech Tzedek from the second Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was one of the greatest Gedolim of his time. Yoredesim Memhei. His Oiris Tshuva was an Enikel, grandson of the Chassam Sofer Chelik Davitzim and Lamed Hay, and he deals with an army base that was designated for Jewish young soldiers in Tsarist Russia's army. And that was a terrible period for Jews and the Cantonistim. I don't want to tell the story right now. But there was an army base that served Jewish soldiers, and the government gave permission to have a kosher kitchen. But obviously, the Russians never really loved the Jews, and there was a lot of difficulty to maintain that kosher kitchen. And the Hisoiris Tshuva, Reb Shimon Sofer Paskins, that even though Treifes might be a Miyat HaMotzi, because of the terche, we could rely on Roiv, even though it's a Miyat HaMotzi. So once again, in this halacha, Holchem Achar Rav, Miyat HaMotzi, we need to be mevarer, and we find the machlokes. do we need to be mavarer even though it involves terchi yeseda, terchi gedola? Source number 5 is the Gemara in Avodah Zorah Lamed Zayin Amid Beis, and we're dealing with the concept of Sofek Tumah B'Rishus Harabim. Sofek Tumah B'Rishus Harabim Tohoyo, and that is Halocha LaMoshe Messinai. So the Gemara says in Avodah Zorah Lamed Zayin Amid Beis, when they came before Rav Yanai, and they asked a question regarding Sofek Tumah B'Rishus Harabim, Rav Yanai said, Hu Maya B'Shikasa Zulu Tvulo. He responded and he said, here's the key to the mikveh. Go and be toivel. What does that mean? But you were asked the question, Sofek Tumah B'Rishus Harabim, Toma or Tor? And what was his response? Here's the mikveh. Go, do tefillah. Which once again is the same fundamental principle. Why rely lekula b'sfeikis, even though it's a din Torah that we could rely on the kula? The first 4 sources, 2 of them touched upon roiv and the other upon chazaka. Source number 5 is Sofek Tumah B'Rishus Harabim, which is Sveikei Torah Men HaTorah Lo Chol HaMoshe Messinai. But Rav Yanai feels, but if you could get out of it without relying on a kula, why not do so? You have the mikveh. Do tefillah. Is that once again a midas chasidus or a din? Same question we asked in our previous sources. Machloikas, Rabbi Kiva again, Gil and Shas on the spot. Avodah Zorah Lamed Zayin Amid Beis. Is Mitzayin Perek Kei Taharas Mishnah Aleph Rash. The Rash says it's a din. To the extent, if there's a mikveh, and it's not a terech yeseda to go looking for a mikveh elsewhere. You have a mikveh right here. And he did not do tefillah, and he touched the haras, we are machmir, and we do not rely on Sofek Tumah B'Rishus Harabim Sveikei Torah. But that's a tremendous chiddush. Rambam, Perek Tes Vav Halacha Tes, Shar Avois HaTumah, and the same in the Meiri on the spot, Lamed Zayin Amid Beis and Avodah Zorah. The Rambam writes, when a person comes and he asks a question regarding Sofek Tumah B'Rishus Harabim, we would say, Im tovalto, ein bekach hefsed, ve'im toval hareze mishubach. Clearly saying, it's not a chiyuv, it's only the right thing to do, and it's a midas chasidus. So once again, it is only if you have a mikveh and it's not a great tercha. But if it's a tercha, you need to go looking for a mikveh. We rely lechatchila on Sofek Tumah B'Rishus Harabim Sveikei Torah. So I said before, according to Tvua Shor, it's impossible to clearly define what is a tercha? What's a tercha yeseda? So just from the few basic sources we spoke about today, let me ask a very simple question. What's a greater tercha? Going to the mikveh, undressing, doing tefillah, dressing up again and coming back, or checking your tzitzis? What's a greater tercha? Every sensible person would say, what do you mean? Going to the mikveh is 10 times as much tercha. How long does it take the average person to check his tzitzis? Anywhere between 5 seconds, 10 seconds? Shouldn't be more than that. If you're really a schlepper and you're half blind, it'll take you 15 seconds. Going to the mikveh, doing a tefillah and coming back, some chassidim do shai tefillahs, 310 tefillahs, but even if you're a zoriz, you're really a zoriz, it'll take you, a minimum 15 minutes, 20 minutes. So that's not defined as a tercha. And the Gemara says, go to the mikveh, what's your problem? And at least the Shivasiyat argues, checking your tzitzis is a tercha. So I explained before, checking your tzitzis every day in the morning is somewhat of a nuisance. Mashenkin, if it's just coincidental. He went through a bika and he got into a Sofek Tumah B'Rishus Harabim, we say go to the mikveh. So I just come to once again stress the point. How do we define terch? It's lefi winyan. It's not uniform. It's not the same in every shaila and in every different sugya. So I find this sugya quite fascinating. So we embarked on our journey today from Hilchas Tzitzis, the din that you need to be boidik your tzitzis, but I dealt and I discussed 5 sugyas. There are many more dealing with similar questions, but I just chose 5 because just to get a broader picture and to understand that in 4 out of the 5 sources I quoted, there is a machlokes, whether it's Midas Chasidus or it's Me'ikar Adin, and there is a machlokes whether a person needs to be mevared even though it is based on tercha. So I find this a very interesting and fascinating discussion. Halacha lamaisa, ein lanu ela divrei haposkim, in each and every sugya into itself, even though there definitely is something which is a tzad shova between all the sugyas that I mentioned and I discussed.